In September 2025, at an event during Climate Week in New York City, 4 conservation organisations from 4 South American countries stood together and announced something that had never been attempted anywhere on Earth. They were not proposing a wildlife reserve. They were not protecting a single national park. They were proposing to reconnect 1 million square miles of fractured jungle, river basin, and wetland into a single living corridor. The territory they described spans roughly twice the size of Alaska. It runs through Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay. It crosses deserts, river systems, and the ancient floodplains of one of the great watersheds of the Southern Hemisphere. And, at the centre of it all, as both symbol and engine, is an animal that most people assume is already nearly gone. The jaguar. Not a population of jaguars in a single reserve. A continent-scale network designed so that jaguars can move, breed, and sustain a connected gene pool across the length of South America. This is the story of how 4 nations, 4 organisations, and 40 years of science chose to stop managing decline and start engineering recovery. And almost nobody is talking about it. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. The jaguar was once the apex predator of 2 continents. It ranged from what is now the American Southwest all the way to the southern tip of Argentina. In the 19th century, jaguars were documented near Monterey, California. One was shot at the North Platte River in Colorado. The species occupied a historic range of nearly 7.5 million square miles at the turn of the 20th century. That figure has now collapsed to roughly 3.5 million square miles. In a single century, the jaguar lost more than half of everything it ever called home. It is gone from El Salvador, gone from Uruguay. The last breeding female in the United States was killed before 1970. The jaguar is not just a beautiful animal in a conservation brochure, it is a process. A single adult male requires more than 50 square miles of territory. It regulates the populations of pecaries, capybaras, deer, and caimans. Those prey animals, kept moving and culled by the jaguar, prevent overgrazing and maintain the structure of the forest. Where jaguars thrive, rivers run clear. Vegetation remains intact. Carbon stays in the ground. Remove the jaguar and those processes slow and eventually fail. The destruction came in waves. Ranchers killed jaguars to protect livestock, and governments encouraged clearing to expand the agricultural frontier. Then in the 1960s, the global fashion industry discovered jaguar pelts. More than 15,000 jaguars were killed every single year in the Brazilian Amazon during that decade. Not 15,000 over a generation, 15,000 per year. The pelt trade was eventually banned in the 1970s, but by then, the damage was profound. Populations were fragmented. The continuous forests that had once connected distant groups were replaced by soybeans, sugarcane, and cattle pasture. By 2025, roughly 55% of the jaguar's historic range had been permanently altered or destroyed. Of the subpopulations that survive today, 33 out of 34 are classified as either critically endangered or endangered. The Paraná Basin, which lies at the heart of the Jaguar Rivers initiative, tells this story in miniature. The Paraná River stretches nearly 3,000 miles, draining a watershed that once held an almost unbroken matrix of forest, wetland, and floodplain connecting 4 nations. Today, the basin contains more than 130 major dams. The Atlantic forest biome, which once covered the eastern flank of this watershed, has lost more than 85% of its original extent. The Chaco to the west is being cleared at one of the fastest rates of any ecosystem in the world. What was once a biological highway for every species in the basin has become a patchwork of isolated fragments, each too small to sustain a jaguar population on its own. Isolated populations do not simply shrink, they collapse. Inbreeding erodes immunity, prey becomes locally depleted, and then the cats disappear, one by one, in silence. The turning point did not begin with a policy document or a government treaty. It began with a young scientist and a promise made to a caged jaguar in New York City. Alan Rabinowitz grew up in Queens in the 1960s with a severe stutter that made normal communication nearly impossible. As a boy, he made regular visits to the Bronx Zoo and would stand in front of the big cat enclosure, talking quietly to the jaguar inside. He later wrote that the jaguar was the one creature who never made him feel broken. He made a promise there. He said that if he ever found his voice, he would become the jaguar's voice. He found it. In 1982, Rabinowitz travelled to Belize as a graduate student to study jaguars in the Coxcomb Basin, a stretch of jungle that had been logged for cedar and mahogany until the timber ran out and the machinery stopped. The loggers had left, the jaguars had stayed. Rabinowitz spent 2 years there, trapping and radio collaring jaguars, crawling through the undergrowth with botfly larvae burrowing into his skin, mounting radio antennas on trees to track animals that most experts considered too elusive to monitor. What he found changed the trajectory of jaguar science. The Coxcomb Basin contained the highest jaguar density ever recorded at that time. In 1986, after years of lobbying, Rabinowitz and his colleagues convinced the government of Belize to designate the area as the world's first jaguar preserve. The sanctuary covered 200 square miles of tropical forest. And within that small act, an idea took root. Where jaguars were protected, jaguars came back. Rabinowitz spent the following decades scaling that idea. He became co-founder and chief scientist of Panthera, the global wildcat conservation organisation, and he argued persistently that jaguars were not a collection of isolated populations requiring separate conservation strategies. They were a single species, connected by invisible biological pathways that humans had been severing without understanding. In 2001, geneticist Eduardo Isaric and colleagues published a study that confirmed what Rabinowitz had been insisting. Jaguars from northern Mexico and jaguars from northern Argentina were genetically indistinguishable. There were no subspecies. There was one jaguar, and its genetic coherence depended on connectivity that stretched across 2 continents. Protecting a reserve was necessary, but it was not sufficient. You had to protect the pathways too. That insight became the architecture of the Jaguar Corridor Initiative. Rabinowitz and Panthera landscape ecologist Kathy Zeller modelled the corridors connecting the 90 core jaguar populations researchers had identified across the species range. The result was a map of 182 corridors spanning 18 nations across 2 continents. The total conservation network covered more than 1.7 million square miles. Some corridors are hundreds of miles wide and pass through intact forest. Others are less than 6 miles wide, squeezed between a soy plantation and a highway. 44 corridors are considered at imminent risk of permanent closure. A corridor that closes does not reopen on a human timescale. When 2 populations stop exchanging individuals, they stop exchanging genes. And when genes stop moving, populations drift slowly toward local extinction, even when individual animals appear healthy. The Jaguar Rivers initiative, launched in September of 2025 at the Explorers Club in New York during Climate Week, represents the most ambitious ground-level response to that corridor map that has ever been organised. 4 organisations, each with decades of real field experience, joined forces to rebuild the corridor from the inside out. Fundación Rewilding Argentina, led by Sofia Heinonen, had already spent 25 years transforming degraded private land into functioning national parks. Since 2010, the organisation had donated more than 460,000 hectares of land to create and expand 10 parks, protecting more than 1.6 million hectares. 12 species that had been extirpated from the Argentine region, including the jaguar and the giant river otter, had been successfully reintroduced. In Brazil, Oncofari had pioneered the habituation of wild jaguars to human observers for ecotourism, building some of the most sophisticated jaguar monitoring systems in the world and managing more than 2 million hectares of corridor influence area between the Amazon and the Pantanal. It was also the first organisation anywhere in the world to successfully return captive-raised jaguars to the wild. In Bolivia, Nativa had helped establish and co-manage 12 protected areas, including the Nembe Guasu Reserve, which alone covers 1.2 million hectares of intact Chaco ecosystem. In Paraguay, Fundación Moisés Bertoni manages the Ambaracayú Forest Reserve, 64,000 hectares of endangered Atlantic forest, while also providing clean water access to more than 40,000 people in surrounding communities. The initiative runs on 4 pillars. The first is ARCs, the large intact ecosystems at the core of the corridor, places where apex species still exist in viable numbers, and from which wildlife can disperse outward into the wider landscape. The second is buffer areas, zones surrounding the arcs where restorative economies reduce human-wildlife conflict and extend ecological protection without requiring formal protected area designation. The third is stepping stones, smaller private reserves and wildlife refuges positioned along the corridors, offering dispersing animals somewhere safe to move between the large arcs. The fourth, and perhaps the most original contribution of this initiative, is rivers and floodplains treated as corridors in their own right. The rivers of the Parana Basin are managed as ecological lifelines. Protected through citizen monitoring networks, ecological flow agreements and riverside vegetation programs. The river is not background, the river is infrastructure. Howard Quigley, who directed Panthera's Jaguar program until his death in 2022, had a phrase that captures the biological truth underneath all of this. He said, in his words, the jaguar itself established the Jaguar corridor. What he meant was that the connectivity already exists in the animal's behaviour. A mature male jaguar disperses anywhere from 15 to 80 miles from its birthplace to find its own territory and avoid mating with relatives. Multiply that behaviour across tens of thousands of individual animals, across thousands of generations, and you get a living genetic highway. The scientists did not design the corridor. They mapped what the jaguar had already built across 2 continents. And then they began the work of keeping it open, and the data coming out of the partner organisations in the years leading up to the initiative's launch started to tell a story that nobody had fully modelled. At Cayman Pantanal in Brazil, Oncofari's monitoring team recorded 1,131 individual jaguar sightings in 2025 alone. 1 station, 1 year. Most of those sightings involved females. 82.7% of all records were of females, and many were accompanied by cubs. At the beginning of Oncofari's work at that site, sightings were rare and sometimes went weeks without a single confirmed encounter. Today, they are regular enough that researchers track individual behavioural repertoires, document mother-cub relationships across multiple seasons, and map territory establishment in real time. The model said the population was small, slow-growing, and fragile. The data refused to fit those models. The population was expanding, and it was doing so faster than anyone had expected. In Argentina's El Impenetrable National Park in the Chaco region, Rewilding Argentina's a jaguar reintroduction program produced results that left field biologists struggling to describe them in scientific terms. Cubs born in the wild to reintroduce jaguars were surviving and establishing territories. The jaguar, absent from the Argentine Chaco for decades, was breeding there again. The reintroduced individuals were not just surviving, they were doing what jaguars do when conditions allow. They were building a population. Here is the key comparison that the models were not capturing. Maintaining the ecological function of a healthy Parana Basin watershed through intact habitat, keystone predators and connected river systems costs a fraction of what replicating those functions through built infrastructure would require. A functioning wetland filters water, buffers floods, sequesters carbon, and regulates temperature. An engineering project that attempted to replace those services across 1 million square miles would cost more than any conservation budget in the history of the species. The 3-year operating budget for the entire Jaguar Rivers initiative is approximately $78 million. That is the cost of keeping the process running, not building a substitute for the process. Keeping the original. This is not romantic nature worship, this is hard-nosed economics. A Jaguar roaming a live corridor maintains more ecological function per year than any piece of engineered infrastructure yet constructed to replace what it provides for free. But this is not a simple victory story, and the Channel has never told those. The Chaco, which flanks much of the Western Corridor, is being cleared at a pace that routinely outstrips the capacity of any single organisation to respond. Agricultural expansion in Paraguay and Argentina moves with the speed of commodity markets, not the speed of policy negotiations. The families who cleared that land are not abstractions. They are people who farmed under government incentive programs they were told were legal, who built livelihoods in a region the state once offered freely to anyone willing to work it. A rancher in the Paraguayan dry Chaco, whose family has managed land for 3 generations, is not an obstacle. He is a stakeholder whose economic reality has to fit inside any solution that is going to last. The science on this is unambiguous. Jaguar density in heavily deforested sites in the Paraguayan dry Chaco has been measured at less than half the density of sites with intact forest cover. For every 10% of forest lost, landscape resistance to Jaguar movement increases by approximately 12%. That number compounds quickly. When corridors narrow below a threshold, populations stop exchanging genes. When genes stop moving, the corridor becomes a mirage. Cats still exist, but they exist in genetic isolation. And that is where local extinction quietly begins. The Jaguar Rivers initiative is working to build what it calls buffer zone economies, ecotourism models, and payment for ecosystem services structures that can make coexistence economically viable for the communities living inside the corridor. Those models are still being tested and refined. There are no finished answers. There is ongoing negotiation and ongoing trust building, and an acknowledgement that no corridor can survive if the people living inside it see only cost and no benefit. The initiative's leaders have said this openly. Sophia Heinonen, Chief Executive Officer of Rewilding Argentina, said at the launch that the world must begin to imagine new maps. Maps not defined by national borders, she said, but guided by nature at their core. That statement is a vision. The work of turning it into a reality belongs to the decades ahead. Return for a moment to a clearing in Belize in 1982. A young scientist with a stutter has just arrived in a basin that loggers left behind. The trees are growing back. The jaguars are there. He cannot see them yet, but they are there, in the dark beyond his headlamp, carrying in their genes the memory of a range that once stretched from Colorado to Patagonia. He's going to spend 2 years crawling through that forest and emerge with data that changes everything. And 43 years later, 4 countries will stand in a room in New York and announce a plan to give those invisible pathways back. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when a species is given the room to persist, and when enough people choose to believe that persistence is worth protecting. 1 million square miles, twice the size of Alaska, announced during a single week in September, and almost nobody noticed. What surprised you most about this? Was it the scale of what has already recovered, or the scale of what still hangs in the balance? Tell us in the comments. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.